马上就要进入2017年了，虽然今年历经了美国大选、英国脱欧的话题，还有中国的经济成长趋缓，而且部分地区也还笼罩着恐怖攻击的阴影。展望明年，金融市场会不会又出现黑天鹅呢？来听听看专家怎么说。
关键时刻掌握关键对话，观众朋友大家好，我是陈莹慧。在美国大选之后，川普确定入主白宫，他在竞选时的政见，还有当选后的一言一行，都牵动了全球的局势。我们今天很高兴邀请到博瑞投资的首席经济学家 Marcus Sumer 来跟我们一起分析2017年的金融市场。Hello, Marcus.
Hi, it's nice to be here.
Three elements that President-elect constantly emphasized: tax cut, drastic immigration reform, and protectionist measures. And these three elements forms a Trump-economics. What will this mean to financial market, and what's your take on that?
Well, I think we would have to take these one by one. And I think it depends more which of Trump's policies will be implemented first. And at PineBridge Investments, we believe the easiest one to implement is his program for tax cuts for households, tax cuts for corporations. And I think that will boost consumer spending and boost business investment. And as a result, economic growth next year and in 2018 will be higher than we had expected before. Now, when it comes to trade, I think this is the risk that we all look at, especially with regards to emerging markets. But we believe it will be much more difficult for Donald Trump to implement any trade protectionist policies because they would directly hurt US business interests. So therefore, we believe there will be maybe some announcements, maybe some tweets, but we don't think there will be any major policy changes that would constitute anything like a trade conflict, for example. And finally, on immigration, we believe that he will tighten immigration into the US, but that will actually cause problems because we already have a situation where there's not enough labor, there are not enough workers anymore in the US. So if Donald Trump tightens immigration, there will be some implications for businesses that rely traditionally on immigrant workers.
What about the impact on this could have brought to financial market globally, and which is the worst scenario? Is the rise of trade protectionism or Fed hike rate that faster than expectation?
So far, I think the impact of Donald Trump on financial markets has mostly been on equities. Equities are stronger because of the expectations of stronger growth and stronger corporate profits. The other initial impact was on bond markets, where we've seen bond yields rise significantly on the anticipation of higher inflation and potentially more Fed rate hikes. Now, we don't believe that inflation will be significantly higher next year. We don't believe that the Federal Reserve will increase the pace of rate hikes next year. And in fact, we see the biggest risk not so much on trade, but in Europe, where I think the fact that Donald Trump can win an election is increasing the chance that someone like Donald Trump can win an election in Europe. And there are elections in 4 of the 5 largest economies in Europe. And I think that raises the risk that one of these elections will go wrong and create a significant crisis there. So that's where we actually see the biggest risks next year.
Which industry will be hardest hit?
Hardest hit in a very negative scenario technically would of course be industries that are exposed to trade, because the negative scenario, the black swan, so to say, right? The black swan would be a trade war and protectionism. But in the scenario where the focus is more on tax cuts and stronger growth in the US, I think there will not be many losers, there will be many winners. And in fact, one of our views at PineBridge Investments is that Donald Trump may actually be good for trade and not bad for trade. You know, everybody else right now thinks about Donald Trump will be bad for trade, and therefore emerging markets are underperforming right now. But we actually believe that Donald Trump can boost business investment in the US. We could see manufacturing around the world increasing, and trade could actually be stronger next year, not weaker.
US economy is getting stronger while Europe and Japan continues QE. Will developed countries still be the hot zone for invest or emerging countries?
At PineBridge, we don't really look at this as a developed world against emerging market case. We look at stories where we can see improving fundamentals that result in lower interest rates and either rising bond markets or rising equity markets. And we look for them, and when we find them, we invest in them. And if they're on emerging markets, that's fine. If they're in developed markets, that's fine. If they were on the moon, we would invest in them on the moon. So the stories right now that we like are the US because of the fundamental improvement as a result of Trump. But we also like stories like India.
Will America still be the most attractive market to invest in the future?
I think America will be one of the attractive markets, yes, because especially because of Donald Trump, the biggest momentum of improvement is in America. However, having said that, markets are overvalued, right? Or at least highly valued in equities and also in bonds. So it is probably too simple to say, oh, it is just the US market. I think you have to look at other stories like Brazil, like India, but potentially also Japan, where I think Trump could help the Bank of Japan weaken the currency there, and a weaker Japanese yen is exactly what the economy needs to generate inflation and economic growth, and that could actually strengthen the equity market in Japan.
And as for the emerging country, is there any well-performed or have great potential investment target that you recommend?
The fundamental improvement stories are Brazil. Here it's really the fact that interest rates are extremely high and there's a potential for significant rate cuts in the next few years. But we see similar reform cycles emerging now in countries like Indonesia and Peru, and even Russia is a country that could benefit if Donald Trump were to succeed in reducing the sanctions that have been crippling the economy in Russia. If sanctions were to be removed, I think we would see a significant recovery in Russia, and that's another fundamental story that's Trump-related that we're watching.
Back to Asia market, especially China and India, what will drive their economic growth?
I think there are two different growth drivers. In India, it is really now the economic reforms that the Modi government has implemented in the last few years that have increased the growth potential in India, and the economy is now running at a 7 to 8% growth rate, and I think can run on that level for a few more years. In China, I think it's a different story. China's economy is slowing, but the government, I think, has been quite successful in slowing down the rate at which the economy is slowing. So we're not seeing these significant reductions anymore every year. In fact, we believe the economy is probably close to stabilizing somewhere between 6 and 6.5%, and we may not see any significant further slowdown. And I think that's a good story for China.
That's a pretty positive estimate and bring us back to the fact and the big topic of the day. What are the key investment themes of 2017?
I think the key investment themes of 2017 are related, on the one hand, to increased fiscal policy. That's new. We haven't had that in many years. We're seeing it now potentially in the US on a very large scale, but we also expect to see it, in fact we are seeing it in China, where the government's using more fiscal policy to stimulate and stabilize growth, and we expect to see it in Japan. So more fiscal policy, and companies and sectors that are related to fiscal policy spending, infrastructure, for example, are one investment theme. The other one, in our view, is actually trade related. We would start to look for companies and sectors that would benefit from an increase in trade if Donald Trump succeeds in boosting business investment.
Okay, we heard a lot of good news, but is there any risk that investors should be aware of for the coming year?
Yes. And that major risk is essentially the other side of the Donald Trump election. The fact that we all got our forecast wrong for Donald Trump, but also for Brexit earlier this year, I think is a reminder that some of these political events can have serious consequences. And we are now quite concerned that political risk in Europe is something that we really need to pay attention to. I would have thought the likelihood of a bad election outcome is very low, but now we had two events that also seem to be low probability, but essentially it came true. So we're now quite nervous that the number of elections we're seeing in Europe could result in a crisis there, where markets once again test the viability of the euro and maybe even start a new banking crisis like we saw a few years ago. Just over the weekend, the Italian referendum on constitutional reform failed and the government had to resign, so there will be new elections next year. And markets are extremely nervous about Italy, where the banking system is the weakest and the likelihood of a crisis is probably greatest.
Thank you, Marcus. We're gonna leave there. 感谢博瑞投资首席经济学家 Marcus Sumer 今天为我们做的2017年财经趋势分析，希望提供您一些想法跟思考的面向。也感谢您收看，我是陈莹慧，我们下次再会。